Joining us now is Elisa Ewers. She's Senior Fellow for the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, along with Steve Yates, who is Deputy National Security Advisor to Dick Cheney, is now a Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to both of you. Elisa, let me start with you and the level. I want to get to the NATO allies, the call to them in just a moment, but I want to start with this dissonance that we've been focused on this morning. That is the president talking about the prospects of winding down this war while floating the notion that there could be an invasion of Karg Island in the coming days. Not saying yes or no either way, but the specter of that still looms large. How do you see the timeline of this war as we approach the start of the fourth week of it being colored by what the president has said and posted here in recent hours?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And I think the president has said it numerous times over the course of the last 3.5 weeks that the war would wrap up soon, that this was a relatively easy and successful operation. And what we're seeing, I think, is that the Iranian regime has certainly raised the costs of the war, made it a little bit more difficult for the president to claim success. It's unclear to me whether this is simply another pronouncement by the president to maybe change the subject or even to continue to confuse both the regime and others about what he intends to do, or whether this is real and he's looking for an off-ramp. As you say, there are Marines coming into the Persian Gulf this weekend. Additional resources and assets have been mobilized as well. So all of these kind of send confusing signals as to the president's intentions, whether he's looking for an exit ramp or really not intending to declare success quite yet.
And Steve, I want to revisit something we were talking about in the last block. I'm wondering if you can help us understand the policy goals behind this latest OFAC waiver, because the vast majority of this Iranian oil is already pre-purchased or called for by China. So the U.S. has just given a strategic competitor a big discount on energy, given Iran up to $14 billion in revenue, while at the same time bombing that country. And none of that oil is likely, or not enough of that oil is likely to hit the market at large to make a difference in oil prices. So what are we doing here?
Well, I think one of the gravest errors in all the analysis I've seen basically for 3 weeks is to try to draw long-term conclusions from short-term events, and basically heavily weighting the public relations analysis rather than what are the facts on the ground and what is changing. It's completely consistent to try to demonstrate that some things will move and that we're a reasonable negotiator if you will back down and basically engage. Iran's, what's left of its leadership, has chosen not to negotiate several times. And so basically they are terrorizing the Straits at this point. They don't control the Strait of Hormuz. They control the ability to fire upon people who deign to use it.
Right. So understanding all that, why issue a waiver that makes it easier for them to sell some of this stuck oil?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I say, right, so given all that, why issue this OFAC waiver? How does that help take down that regime?
Well, the regime is already heavily damaged. And of course, there are remnant capabilities that can lash out. They, after all, what's demonstrated, much to the dismay of analysts who said it wasn't possible, that they had a missile capable of going multiple thousands of miles in the direction of Diego Garcia, which means it could also reach continental Europe and have the same kind of terror effect that many people said there was no imminent threat of existing. So what's happening is in 3 weeks, the regime has been heavily degraded. International markets have experienced a shock. There are a lot of things that need to happen to manage that shock. But it's really not a good look for NATO to act as if a disinterested bystander in international markets and freedom of navigation on the seas. That is, I think, where President Trump is correct. When you have numbers that are together moving cargo through there, Iran won't have this just be targeting only the United States or Israel as the prime contenders in what needs to happen with the free flow of resources.
All right, Lisa, Steve doesn't want to seem to answer that question, so I will ask it to you. What is the policy goal behind this OFAC waiver?
I think this is part of the assurance campaign that the administration has undertaken to try and calm markets. Its steps so far have not worked, right? Markets have responded over the last 10 days, especially quite acutely to the war. And so pronouncements on lifting sanctions on Russian oil, which we can talk about in a moment what that means for NATO, agreeing to underwrite insurance for those who are trying to transit the strait. Escorts were talked about. Now this OFAC license. These are all steps to try and stabilize markets and bring the price down. That's not how markets have been responding. It's also unclear how this license exactly is going to work. As you indicated, this is oil that's already loaded in tankers, has buyers, has destinations. What I would add on the kind of risk that the regime has placed the strait under, what's different, I think, from the way we have looked at this problem set before, is that we always assumed when the regime would make good on the threat to close the strait that it would come to a high cost to the regime itself, meaning it couldn't move its oil either. But what we're seeing is that Chinese tankers, Indian tankers are moving through. And so Iranian oil is moving. It's everything else that's stuck inside the strait that is not moving.
Steve, when you think about the relationship between the U.S. and NATO, the relationship between the U.S. and European allies, you talk about long-term consequences and short-term events here. The rhetoric from this administration in this term, and indeed the term before it, during the first term of the Trump administration, has been somewhat adversarial toward those long-standing alliances, those multilateral alliances. I'm curious, as you look at this now, do you think that it was at all a misstep on the part of this administration in Israel not to try to rally those allies earlier in advance of these strikes? In other words, they're making this entreaty now for these allies to come in and help patrol the Strait of Hormuz. Is this something that could have been worked on or agreed to before these strikes took place now 3 weeks ago?
Unequivocally, no. There was no circumstance where there was going to be any get from these alleged allies going into this. Another one of the framing errors has been sort of talk about disregard for allies. Well, Israel is an ally of the United States. So are the Gulf allies that are part of the Abraham Accords. And there's been a broader problem here, and Europe has been a part of it. The United States and past administrations, including the one in which I served, was a part of the problem in assuming that the only way to deal with this protracted problem of 4+ decades was to basically negotiate some kind of settlement where we pay a lot to the regime in Tehran, and then we would negotiate some kind of appeasement to allow this terror to continue. I think at some point that cost becomes too high and risky action has to be taken. I don't like necessarily every element of this action, but there was no chance that the governments in the major capitals of Europe were going to sign on to this. For decades, they had been on the side of the deals like the JCPOA and others, which did not keep the cork in the bottle.
Elisa, quickly before I let you go, there's a clip circulating where the NATO Secretary Mark Rutte is asked by a journalist why Europe doesn't just say to the U.S., okay, you want us to patrol the strait, this is what we want in Ukraine. And you see his face and he kind of goes, that's actually a good idea. Is it a good idea? Should they do that?
Europe always has leverage, I think, in the alliance that it may not use to the best effect here. I think you have to remember that this relationship is under a lot of strain. It wasn't all that long ago that we were talking about Greenland. So the unpredictability of the administration's approach on a number of important policy issues to Europe is part of the equation here. So could Europe turn this into a discussion about what it needs from Washington? Sure. But I think the fact that there's such a lack of trust and discomfort with the unpredictability of President Trump's approach feeds into whether or not you can trust that conversation can produce what Europe might need.